Hello, U.S. history students. So, this is the last section of this unit, Transforming the West, which is basically about the idea of the end of the Wild West. And the way we're phrasing that, as far as your focus question is concerned, is what does it mean that the frontier closed and why does it matter? So, again, the phrase the closing the frontier basically means the end of the Wild West, or at least, the end of people believing the West was wild. So this first image I want to show you folks is a modern day population density map of the United States. And so you can see, if you follow my cursor, kind of where the T is in the word Boston is where you live, Western Massachusetts. And you can see it's a relatively less dense area and a very, very dense area. And in fact, the area between Washington, D.C. and Boston, Massachusetts, along the coast of New England and the mid Atlantic, is known as the Boswash megapolis because there's no unurbanized areas in the entire stretch. So you kind of live in the thick of things. As you look further to the west, the lighter colors indicate in areas of lower population density, in large part because of the unit we're looking at now. So the way people settled. The locations where there's lots and lots of folks tend to be locations that it's easy to get to. If you look at California, ocean travel allowed settlement in the West you remember back from US 1 with the California Gold Rush in 1849 on the far West Coast. But this section here in particular is about how we fill in some of these areas in the middle. Oops. All right. So the basic pattern of westward settlement was about boomtowns being created to exploit a natural resource, and in particular, something that is um, the word is not exploitable, but basically it gets eliminated. It's a non-renewable resource. So non-renewable resources like gold and silver and oil in the hills, or in some communities water. So the water levels in an area would be tapped by wells and then they would run out. But it's largely industries like gold and silver that create these boom towns. The resource runs out, and you end up in a situation like this image here, and you get these cool gold abandoned towns from the late 19th century in the middle of nowhere. And so the town does one of two things. It's going to do what this does, or if it's a city like Denver, Colorado, it will diversify its economy and kind of stick around. And that's largely because it's easy to get to. So Denver is a railroad hub. Again, we mentioned San Francisco and Los Angeles. They're on the coast, easy to get to by sea. Ghost towns are cool looking. This is one in Montana. And again, this exists. This is part of, I believe it's one of the national parks in Montana. I cannot recall the name of it, but it's near Anaconda Copper, which we'll be looking at in one of the later slides, near Butte. So, speaking of later slides, that smokestack, if you look at the train cars in the foreground, is over 300 feet tall. That is a gigantic, gigantic smokestack. And what you're looking at actually is a copper smelter. And in the late 1800s, this was a boom town that had produced more than a quarter of the world's copper. And it basically is a business town. It's a company town, like we looked at in our industrialization unit. These large companies basically get bigger and bigger and bigger to the point where that's a literal mountain with a smelter underneath where they melt down copper ore and then use the railroad, which often possesses large quantities of the land and may have sold land to these mining companies, to basically move people in when they need to extract the resource, extract it, and then they're done. And I have an image in a minute to show you the end result of this smelting operation. But a quarter of the world's copper came from this, including, the dynamo under Niagara Falls, for example. This is just a diagram of how smelting works. And long story short, you can pause the video and look at this image, or if you have the slides, you just look at the slides. Fossil fuels are used for energy. It heats up the metal until the different materials in the stone, the ore that's mined out from the hillside, separate. And then you use that energy and you basically pump everything through various sieves, and the layers settle out, and you've got waste at the bottom called slag, which is full of chemicals like arsenic and other poisons. And then you have what you are going for in the case of Anaconda, the smokestack in the last image, copper, but in other cases, silver, platinum, gold. So this is the end result of the Anaconda Copper Company. And so this is the city of Butte, Montana. That is a gigantic pit. It's about a mile wide or so at its max when it fills up with poison water. And it's an arsenic filled lake that, if the city of and the state of Montana didn't continuously pump out the water, would overflow and destroy this community, where incidentally the University of Minnesota is, because, and the only opera in Montana, fun fact, because this was an extremely wealthy community when it was a boomtown, diversified, but they have this legacy of resource extraction that literally looms over them and could doom the entire city at any time if they weren't actively trying to deal with it. So it's not a victimless crime to leave a giant open mile wide poison lake in a city. If you click on this in the slideshow, you can actually go to Google Maps and see where this city is in Montana. This is the modern day photograph of the Transcontinental Railroad. And so this Transcontinental Railroad that connects the East Coast to the West Coast of the United States, that's what transcontinental means, is the reason that states like Utah are states in the Union. There would not be the ability to travel out to these areas in the middle of the desert without this technology connecting a really harsh landscape. Um, the first section we looked at, Native American land is stolen and then given straight from the broken treaties right to the railroad companies. The Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railways. So the Union Pacific is founded in the Civil War by Abraham Lincoln, and then the Central Pacific is run by a gentleman named Leland Stanford, who you may recognize the last name of from the college in California. So just another thing to think about too, because this U.S. history doesn't happen in a vacuum. These There's a single rail line across the 3,000 miles of the United States at the same time that in Egypt, the British have dug the Suez Canal, shortening the travel between Europe and India, their colony there, by over 10,000 miles. So the world is getting smaller as technology makes it smaller, and faster, as we looked at in that industrialization unit. So, in sum, the West is settled in an industrial process. And in fact, this country that you live in exists in the way it does. The people live where they do because it's a country that was born in the industrial era. So it's very different in a lot of ways as far as settlement patterns because of our history. The railroads were given not money directly by the government, but after land was seized from the tribes, they were given a checkerboard pattern of land in 1 square mile grants, 20 miles off the side of each railroad line. So if you think about how much land is worth, just in general, like everyone I think has an intuitive understanding of that, 20 miles on the side of every railroad line. So all the way across the country, a 40-mile block, half the land was owned by the railroad companies. And they often, they would sell off less desirable land to people who had never seen it and buy the stuff that was more valuable. So just thinking about that, this is an incredibly powerful series of businesses. And part of the reason the government was so corrupt in the late 19th century is they had all this money and no one had any regulations on them. And in fact, they were encouraged to become wealthier and to encourage war with Native Americans to become still richer. And yet, that's the reason the West was settled. Famous photograph of the meeting of the two trains that at Promontory Point in Utah. One thing that isn't often spoken about in this image is that the actual workers of the railroad were mostly not present, unless they were some of the white Protestant workers who were more favored by the railroad company. The Irish Catholic, the freedmen, so the former African American slaves who worked on the Union Pacific Railway, were largely excluded because of their religion and their ethnicity. Coming from the West, there's deep racism against Chinese Americans who largely were responsible for the Central Pacific success, blasting through the difficult terrain of the Sierra Nevada mountains in California. And so this image, just like anything else, really important part of history, interesting to see. But there's more to the story if you do research, and that's just another reason to do that. This is the route. There's a train that still runs on the route of the Transcontinental Railway. Because we haven't upgraded our technology, it takes the exact same amount of time as it did back in 1869, 3 days to travel from Chicago to Emeryville, California, which is right outside of San Francisco. There are other transcontinentals. It wasn't just the one, and then we stopped. I believe there are 5 nowadays. But back in the 19th century, there were 10. So, influence the transcontinental railway. So this is 1876. This is the year 1900. The railway gets built, and you have people moving out to the west, and these states of the union become admitted because there's finally enough population to meet the 30,000 people you need in the Constitution to become a state. So you may have heard of cowboys. Here are pictures of cowboys. It is originally a Mexican strategy for breeding cattle in dry lands. So this is not something that would be useful in the part of the country we live in because it's not the same climate. So basically, Mexican cowboys were called vaqueros, which comes from the Spanish word for cow, and they're cowboys. It means the same thing. And so they were hired in the period after the Civil War in Texas because of the Civil War. There were hundreds of thousands of cattle roaming the plains of Texas because the Confederate armies abandoned their farms effectively. And so these Mexican, black, and white mixed race crews would take cattle from Texas, where there was a surplus, to railheads in Kansas City and Missouri to basically ship to the stockyards in the city of Chicago, where they would be canned using modern technology or shipped in refrigerated rail cars all across the country, beginning the American obsession with the hamburger and other meat consumption went up tremendously because, again, technology allowed the exploitation of resources in the West. That's the pattern we're really looking at here. People saw stuff they can make money out of, and they used technology to get it, including, in the sense, the technology of the technique of being a cowboy that was used, because, again, much of the West was taken from Mexico by the people there. Another accelerator as far as folks going out west from the east, so again, that concept of settler colonialism, is the Homestead Act of 1862. So Abraham Lincoln, again, in the middle of the Civil War, signs the Homestead Act. Doesn't really function until post-Civil War, naturally because people were busy. And so 160 acres to anyone who was willing to farm land, build a road, and a well. And of course, this land is stolen from the native tribes, and the folks that moved in were intended deliberately as part of this racially supremacist policy to replace them. To complicate the story, African Americans from the South fled the terrorism that they were dealing with down there from the KKK and otherwise, and moved to states like Oklahoma, and helped found cities like Tulsa, basically as a success story in the post, of escaping the post-Reconstruction South. Oh, this house is made of dirt, by the way. I forgot to mention that. Most valuable resource in the West is not gold, it's not silver, it's water. You can't mine without water. You can't have cattle without water. And part of the problem is the mining interests and the agriculture interests are constantly competing. So both valuable resources and, these, you're mining, you're polluting the water, your cattle will pollute the water as well. And people need to live in the cities nearby. So you have literal bloodshed over water in the West from the very beginning. And that's still the case if you think about the news about California in modern days. The West is the most ethnically diverse place in the country. 80% of the Asian American citizens, Mexican American citizens, and most of higher than not 80% of the Native Americans lived in the West. Nonetheless, there's still deep discrimination and prejudice. There was often deadly violence, and immigrants in particular are exploited by these corporations like the Anaconda Copper Mining Company. This photograph, though, I think in a lot of ways sums up part of the story of the West. There's a Cheyenne Native American woman who's marrying a mixed race African and Native and white Mexican man, and they both live in California. And so, in a lot of ways, the West is built by America, and this is the result: is an ethnically diverse nation that looks, frankly, more similar to our modern country, and it's kind of a harbinger of that. I couldn't resist, so I put a picture of California on fire in here, and this is basically the end of the Wild West period. Is when the U.S. Census Bureau said the frontier, there was no longer an area of land free of white settlers. Native Americans were not counted by the census, so we have numbers that are based on, frankly, estimates. And these patterns of settlement, this resource extraction, the conflicts over water, the ethnic diversity, the Native American cultures preserved and also embattled in many ways. This is the story of the West even today, and you can see the patterns established by this settlement of the West. If you want to use that word, which you at this point I hope understand why that should be considered, are the modern stories. So what is old is new. These are basically the way the Native American lands were seeded. It's worth taking a look at this. Um, darker colors are more recently or older. So these are the land that was stolen before the Civil War. And you can see the slow whittling away of Native American land. And then very quickly after the railroad comes through.